Okay, we'll jump in because we're a little bit behind from our little fire drill, and we'll try to catch up here. But so we'll start off here with Marjorie Fennell. Thank you, Marjorie, from the Vision Estate Architect. They're our master architect on ADA compliance. And I don't know if Ida is called in too, or if we need to do it. But Ida Claire is our state architect, and she's calling in also in case there are questions.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marjorie Fennell. I'm a senior architect and a certified access specialist for the state of California. I'm sitting in for Ida Claire, our state architect, who's in Northern California today. And I'd like to discuss an interesting topic I hear from most, which is accessibility. And for me, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think it's very direct. I think there have been changes in the building code in the last code edition that makes it extremely clear. Prior to 2016, there were not clear provisions in the state code, and now there are. And we'll go over some of those today and open it up for questions at the end. So what we're going to address today is Chapter 11B in the California Building Code. There are two sections of the building code that deal with accessibility. Chapter 11A is for housing, which is for privately funded housing, and Chapter 11B deals with commercial, public buildings, and public housing. And so we'll only talk about 11B today. The steps in applying the accessibility regulations are fairly simplistic. First, in Title 24, Chapter 2 are the definitions for all the elements that are used in the building code, whether it's building construction materials, whether in the case of EV charging, the actual EV charging stations are defined, the types of spaces are defined for EV charging, as well as other elements of construction that might have a definition that's different than what we typically understand. After we understand the definitions of the EV charging elements, then we go to 11B, Division 2. In Division 2, it talks about the scoping. And in the scoping, it talks about how many and the ratio and where it applies. And there's a table in 11B 228.3 that talks about the total number of parking spaces, EV charging parking spaces, and those that are required to be accessible. And there's a table that I'll show in a second on the next slide that gives a little bit more clarity as to the number of accessible EV charging spaces required in relationship to the total. So after we understand how many we need, then we go to the technical provisions. And the technical provisions are in 11B 812. So that tells you the size of the space, the striping, the colors, the signage, and whether there's a route required to associate with those parking spaces. And then at the tail end of the presentation, we'll talk about path of travel, which is kind of hinting to what you talked about earlier. And path of travel is one of the most misunderstood elements of the building code. But the more you deal with it, the more you understand how important path of travel is. And path of travel is kind of a misnomer. You would think that it's the actual route that one would take, the actual hardscape or the walkway. But in terms of alteration, the building code considers path of travel as all those elements that support your area of work. So if you're building something that's a primary function, you have to have other elements of work to support it, whether it be restrooms, drinking fountains, or an actual route to that area of work. And we'll talk about that a little later. There are two exceptions to providing accessible EV charging stations, charging spaces. And the first has to do with employee use, and the second has to do with residential. So the two exceptions are for EV charging spaces, if they're not available to the general public, and they're intended for use by a designated vehicle or driver. So here's an example in the slide. An EV charging space that is assigned to an employee, an EV charging space serving public or private fleet vehicles is not required to have an accessible spot. The other is for public housing, an EV charge, and we're talking about 11B here, not for privately funded, which is 11A of the building code. So public housing, EV charging spaces intended for use by an EV owner or operator at their residence is not required to be accessible per the building code. So on to scoping, we've looked at Chapter 2 and found the definitions for the elements that we want. And now in scoping. So in scoping tells us how many and how it's applied. And so for new construction, there's no doubt. In new construction, accessible EV charging is required. No two ways about it. When new spaces are added to an existing site or existing EV charging stations, the total number of new and existing are used in determining the accessible EV charging spaces required. And we'll take a look at that table again in the next slide. So if you have new EV charging, there isn't a ratio required for new EV and a ratio required for existing EV. It's the total. You combine the existing and the new, and the total number of EV stations, that ratio determines how many accessible spaces are required. And again, we'll get to that table in the next slide. Also, for technical provisions, they only apply to new and altered EV charging spaces. So if you have existing and they don't comply, as long as you don't touch them, someone said if you touch it, you bought it. If you touch it, you bought it. If you don't touch it and they don't comply, then there's no need to alter them to meet the current code. It's not the best look from an optics standpoint to provide facilities that don't comply, but they're not required by the building code to be altered unless you touch it and you buy it. Here's that illustrious table that I've been talking about and someone alluded to earlier. If EV charging stations are provided, either new or altered, one van accessible space is required. No two ways about it. So from 1 to 4 EV charging stations, at least one van accessible space is required. Now, if you provide 5 to 25, then you need a van accessible and a standard accessible. If you provide 26 to 50, then you need one of each, van, standard, and ambulatory. And in a second, we'll talk about what each one of those means. Question? Hit me.
It is directly to your. Okay, sorry. So what if you've got a site that has multiple EV charging providers? So I build one with 4 charging stations and I provide my one ADA space, and Tesla does 4 and provides their 1.
Yeah.
But we're not in compliance, are we? Because
You
don't
are.
you have to have.
So it's based upon the total number on the site, new and existing. So if Tesla's existing and you're adding, if Tesla has 4 and you're adding 4 more, it's the total of 8.
Okay.
And then if you have 8 per the table, you need 2 stalls, 1 van, 1 standard. So if
they've got a standard, then we would have to provide the van?
take your pick, flip a coin.
Well, I'll
Someone
take
has to
care of it.
provide van. So standard cannot be the single stall.
Okay.
Van is always the single stall, without exception. There is always at least 1 van. So if there was a EV charging project in which accessible spaces were provided and there was no van space provided, that is not in compliance. Great. There's no complaint if you give them more. Van is bigger.
I was just getting to if they were installed at different times, then whoever the representative may have been installed with different facts in mind when reviewing them. So one was installed with a van accessible, and then 6 months to a year later, another one was installed separately, van accessible. At least it would still be compliant.
So a van accessible stall takes up more real estate. The stall space, and we'll get to it later, but since we're here, let's talk about it, is a 12-foot wide stall with a 5-foot access aisle. A standard accessible is 9-foot wide with a 5-foot access aisle. So you have more real estate for van accessible. So van accessible doesn't mean van only. It doesn't say van accessible only, it's just van accessible. So if you have a van, you can utilize a van accessible stall. If there's more than one on the site, great. You've still met the provisions of the code. Now you can't have 2 standard stalls, but you could have 2 van, because so the code, the building code provides for the minimum code compliance. So as a plan reviewer, as an access plan reviewer, I never complain when you give me more. Now, if you don't give me what's minimally required in the code, then I make a fuss. But if you give me what's required or give me a bit more, there's no complaint.
Oh, there we go. I have just 2 quick questions. What's the definition of altered? So how much has to be done to an existing station to trigger an upgrade?
you touch it.
In any way, shape, or what if a piece of equipment is broken or non-functional and it's replaced?
That's repair. That's not alteration.
Okay. And then my second question, this comes up a lot. Is there a standard definition of site? So if a project spans a large area, is it broken up into multiple sites? Does a site count as one piece, one parcel? Is that defined anywhere? Because I've seen that interpreted many different ways in many different areas.
I would direct you to Chapter 2 in the building code, which should have a definition for site. That might be slightly viewed differently by jurisdiction. I'm not sure. That might be a big gray, but I think there is a definition in Chapter 2 of Title 24, Part 2.
Okay, thank you.
Question, would the station require, does it have to be 100% dedicated to that spot? Or can it be shared with adjacent spots around the ADA compliant spot?
I don't think I understand.
The EV charging station that services the ADA compliant spot, can it also serve adjacent spots that are standard parking spaces around it? Or does the station, the EV charging station, have to be dedicated to that one spot?
It does not have to be dedicated to that one
Okay.
spot. What it does have to be dedicated to is a location in proximity to the accessible space relative to the access aisle. So there's an access route from your charging space to the EV charger. And so that route should be near, the charger should be placed near the route. But for all those that aren't accessible stalls, there's no provision in the California Building Code for use or distance.
We've heard some discussion earlier today from some of the funding sources about combo sites, and I know we have a discussion here about Tesla doing, and then maybe Electrify America doing at the same site. When you get into combo sites that use different levels of charging, so level 2 and DC fast charging, are those considered? Do you add those up the same way, or are you considering those separate amenities?
I don't believe the building code considers those separate amenities. What the building code has is electric vehicle charging as terminology. And so it looks at, I don't believe it looks at them separately, to be honest with you.
So the-
Go ahead.
And we also, so Ida's on the line also. If they, I don't know if Ida can, if she's able to speak at all, but so right now that's an active point of discussion is, do we need to clarify the building code to answer it? It's a little bit gray, as Marjorie is saying, is my understanding, but the question is, do we need to, and how do we clarify that? So the state architect's office is working on proposed language, and I know a number of people in the room are tracking that.
And just, I'm not involved in any of the rulemaking, unfortunately. I'm an access compliance reviewer.
Exactly.
So if there are any questions that deal with rulemaking, we can table that and let Ida deal with those at a future time. Apologize. Any other questions? There's one back there.
Hi, one from the webinar. From Kitty Adams, I asked Ida about this pertaining to the Getty. I was told that the parking at the bottom of the hill for public is a separate facility than the Getty parking at the top of the hill for employees and business visitors. I've also heard that a roadway also defines two separate facilities, i.e. the Skirball Museum, where they have a second parking lot on the other side of Sepulveda.
So a site can have multiple designated users. And if the users are restricted and there is public parking, there is employee parking, there are parking areas designated for other groups, and there's EV charging provided for each group, then each has to provide accessible parking. So if there is an employee that has an electric vehicle, they cannot be asked to travel to the public parking area to charge their vehicle and then make their way to the facility. They can't be treated in a respect that's different than any other employee if they have a disability. So if there are designated special user groups, they should have their own, even if they share the same site, they shall have their own accessible elements provided. That's the only caveat to what I mentioned earlier in terms of one site. If there are special designated groups, they have their special areas, then they should have accessible features as well.
So to piggyback on that, Sean Skidmore with Los Angeles County, by the way. Our understanding is that if they are designated special use, for example, separating between fleet use only, employee/workplace, and public access, we would assign the accessibility to the appropriate areas like the workplace and the public access per the chart that we're looking at here. We have kind of approached it, and correct me if this is right or wrong, I mean, that these should be tabled as separate quote unquote facilities. So that if you're charting 20 public access, it's its own number. If you have 35 workplace chargers, it's its own number. It hits this table separately rather than, as you had started in the beginning, a combined total. So for accessibility, do you approach it as a combined total on the site or by the designated use?
It's by the designated use.
Okay,
And
good.
I didn't talk to that earlier. So if you have a site and it's all public parking, and Tesla has a portion on one public parking site and you have a portion on that same public parking site, then that's the combined total. But if you have specific designated users that cannot use other parking areas but their own, then they must meet the provisions of each category
Okay.
in the chart.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that.
I have a question for that.
Am I going to get through my presentation?
No, I mean.
No, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead.
Okay.
That's all
okay.
right. Go ahead.
But so Tesla only charges Tesla vehicles. So is that a different use?
No.
This
So you
is a
could be-
test.
Sounds like Ida, maybe?
That Ida?
It doesn't talk to the maker of the vehicle or the charger. It talks to the user group.
Ida, we can hear you.
Thanks. Sorry for the confusion. Thank you, Marjorie. Just to be
Now we lost her. Ida, if you can hear us, we lost you. Okay, well, Ida, let's table what you were going to say, and then Marjorie, do you want to keep moving on the presentation?
Sure, let's keep moving on. All right, so we've talked about scoping at great length. Let's talk about the actual spaces. So the van spaces that we all, and maybe not love, are 12 feet wide, 18 feet long with a 5-foot access aisle. And in the case of the van accessible stall, the access aisle is always on the passenger side of the vehicle. So for vans, typically there is either a lift or a ramp or some sort of mechanism that allows either the passenger or the driver to exit and enter the vehicle. And that's typically on the sliding door of the passenger side of a car or vehicle. So for a van space, the 5-foot access aisle is only and always on the passenger side. And so there's increased width of the van accessible stall. The vehicle can fit anywhere within that 12-foot width, depending upon where the charger is located. For the standard accessible EV space, it's just like any other accessible space. It's 9-foot wide minimum, and if you give me more, no worries. 18-foot long and 5-foot access aisle. If the spaces are parallel to vehicular traffic, then the actual length of the stall is 2 feet longer. It's 20 feet in the case of both van and standard. It still requires an access aisle, and the width is still the same. So here's an illustration that shows a case if you have over 25 parking spaces or EV charging spaces where you would need a van and a standard accessible. So the illustration shows the van accessible on the left side of the illustration, the 5-foot access aisle shared by the standard and the van, and the standard standard EV charging station on the right side. So van accessible is 12-foot wide, 5-foot access aisle, standard accessible is 9, and an 18-foot length for the stall. So one thing that's unique in EV charging spaces that differs from standard accessible spaces is that the striping color should not be blue. And so what we understand about standard accessible parking spaces is that the blue is a universal color recognized for accessibility. So in the case of EV charging stations, the color should contrast with the ground surface. So if it's asphalt paving, you could use a white or a yellow. If it's concrete, probably a yellow. But in no case should blue be used to identify the striping in EV charging stalls. Additionally, each EV charging stall should have the notes or the text within the surface area, EV charging only in each EV charging space. And then the access aisle, whether it be shared or single, should have the text no parking in 12-inch high white letters. And again, the color blue is not used at all. So the intent here is that accessible EV charging stations are not intended for accessible users only. They're intended for everyone. And that's why the blue color is not used. It's not access only, it's access available. So anyone can use the stations. That's why the blue color isn't used. And depending on the number of spaces, signage is not required as well with the ISA. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Were there any questions on that?
Hi, this is Ramsey with Zero Impact Solutions. If we're sharing an access aisle between a standard accessible and an existing van accessible, for example, but one of them is for charging, does it get painted half green, half blue?
This is Ida here. We're addressing that in rulemaking, and it is meant to be blue. And that's because California statute requires an accessible parking stall to have the blue outline. And so the blue would take priority. And that's in our, offered in our guidance right now in our advisory manual, I believe, but it was in future rulemaking where we make that clear that they can share an access aisle, but it should be painted blue.
Thank you, Aya.
Sorry, I just know that it's future rulemaking and you're not involved in that, so you may not have that answer. So go ahead, sorry.
No, I appreciate it completely, no worries. All righty, so the only other thing I wanted to mention about this slide is that the EV charger is along an accessible route that is served by an access aisle that is shared between the two stalls. Okay. There are two other accessible EV spaces mentioned in the building code, and that is the ambulatory accessible stall, which is 10 feet wide, still 18 feet in length. And in this stall type, or space type, it's not a stall, but in this space type, there's no access aisle required, okay? And so there's additional width. It's larger than the 9-foot stall for standard. It's smaller than the van accessible stall, but there's space to allow for those that have temporary mobility issues to have additional space for maneuvering. Then the last type of space is the drive-up accessible space, which is similar to a fuel pump island. That space is required to be 17 foot in width, 20 foot in length, and there's no access aisle requirement for that either. Okay. Further technical provisions include the accessible route, which was illustrated on the prior slide. So the EV charging stations must be served by an accessible route. That route typically is 4-foot minimum width, slope no more than 2% in cross slope, and running slope no more than 5% in the direction of travel. The route should not be obstructed by cables. If the EV charging stations serve a particular building or facility, then there should be an accessible route serving those spaces. If it does not serve a particular building and the use is parking, then there should be an accessible route serving the pedestrian entrance to the parking area. Okay. For the EV charger itself, it's treated no differently than any other element that's required to be utilized by a person with disability. So the charger should be located on an accessible route, but not block that route. And the charger should be served by a clear floor space. Now, a clear floor space is a 30 by 48 clear area that's level, essentially level, no more than 2%, 1 to 48 in each direction. And that's intended for a person with a disability to have a level stable surface in order to manipulate the equipment. The equipment the operable part should be within reach range. So once I'm in that clear floor space of 30 by 48, the low reach range is 15, the high reach range is 48, whether it's side approach or forward approach. So any element on that charger that has to be manipulated should be within that range and within the area of the clear floor space. Any operable part should not require any more than 5 pounds operation. So if it's a lever, if it's a push button, anything that requires operation, there's a maximum of 5 pounds to activate that element. For point of sale devices, the same sort of requirements apply, clear floor space and reach range for the operable part. And there are some provisions for the touch screen and the video on the point of sale. Okay. Further technical provisions include signage. So unlike a standard accessible parking space, not all EV charging spaces require disabled signage or the international symbol of accessibility. So if there are 1 to 4 stalls, you need a van, accessible stall, but there's no requirement for a sign. And you'll see in the second bullet, as I mentioned earlier, accessible EV charging spaces are designed for accessibility. It's to be used by anyone and not limited to those with an access license plate or placard. So when the numbers increase, as you ratchet up to 5 to 25, then the one van accessible space shall be identified with the ISA. And that's the international symbol for accessibility. It's that white wheelchair symbol in profile on the blue background. So that's required at the van accessible stall or space. I keep saying stall. Space. The standard accessible space is not required to be identified with an ISA. As the numbers grow, then the requirements for signs grow. 26 or more, all van, and all required standard accessible stalls shall be identified with the ISA. The ambulatory accessible and the drive-up are not required to be identified. And we talked a bit earlier about what the cost impact might be for those elements that we didn't expect, those path of travel elements, that bad phrase, path of travel elements. So there's an exception in the California Building Code. So 11B 202.4 is a section of the code that deals with alterations. And it recognizes that an alteration isn't done in isolation. If there is an alteration performed, let's just say a building, and we'll come back to EV charging. If there's a school and there's a classroom altered at the school, the scope of work in a district of mine might just be that classroom. But there are other elements that support the use of that classroom for those students and the staff, that being an actual route to the classroom, the restrooms that serve the students and staff that utilize the classroom, and the drinking fountains. So path of travel is that misnomer I mentioned earlier. Path of travel are those other elements that are needed to support the alteration and usually are not considered when developing the project at its infancy. So exception 10 of 11B 202.4 is an exception that addresses that path of travel requirement. So when installing new EV charging spaces at an existing facility where vehicle fueling, charging, parking, or storage is the primary function, that's the key. If those elements are the primary function, then path of travel improvements may be required if they don't comply. But there's a cap, there's a 20% cap. So if you've achieved 20% and you have not obtained full compliance, that's the max that the code will require. So if that means if you've only modified 100 foot of your walkway as opposed to 200 feet, if you've met that cap, 20% is the max that the code permits. The other component of the exception is if it's an alteration and you're installing new EV charging spaces at an existing facility where vehicle fueling, charging, parking, or storage is not the primary function, the path of travel is not required. So in this school example that I mentioned earlier, the classroom and educating the children is the primary function. If you add EV charging, that's not the primary function, and so a path of travel improvements are not required. Okay. So we've already had a series of questions earlier. If there are more questions, I'd be happy to field them. If there's something I can't answer, Ida is ready and available to respond to any questions you might have.
Well, thank you very much, Marjorie. I think one thing too, just to drive home, there's a lot of information in this, and it's open for a lot of interpretation. And we're seeing at the local level, different building officials have different kind of views of how to apply accessibility regulations. And so the resource that exists at the DSA is really something that should be taken advantage of. And so the best thing you can do is encourage your building official, if they have any confusion or question, they can consult the DSA, and the DSA is happy to help them identify a workable code path forward. I think also, I know we always sense there's a lot of frustration about these regulations and everything. And so the DSA has gone out of their way to really be as flexible in application. I think one example that finally clicked with me is California state law requires a van accessible parking space to be placarded, but that's not a federal requirement. That's California state law going above and beyond. And so because it's not a federal law, that's how the Division of State Architect, the regulations were able to back off that and let that first van accessible spot be available to everyone. So it's an example of what DSA has done to help encourage flexibility, because they acknowledge we want accessibility, but we also have to build this market up. So
if I could just restate one more thing. From an accessibility standpoint, I want to hit the point home that EV charging spaces, again, are not access only. They're just accessible. So if you have the need, they're available. For standard accessible parking spaces in the building code, it's accessible only, and you have to have either a placard or a disabled parking plate, and there are fines associated. If you park in those spaces and you don't have the proper placard or license plate, the minimum fine is $250. And so in addition to the fine being posted at the stall, they also give you warning when you pull into the parking lot. There's a huge sign that says you will be towed if you park and you don't have the proper placard or license plate. So there is a relaxation in terms of the restriction on accessible parking when it comes to EV charging.
great. Well, thank you very much, Marjorie. And just, the Division of State Architect contact information is in the guidebook. If you
Tyson,
so
can
that-
I address
Yeah,
the
please,
group
Ira.
just a second? I know that
Yeah.
we're probably going over time with the ADA. Thank you, Marjorie, for doing such a great job explaining the current code requirements. Just a couple things to understand. We are in the middle of rulemaking right now. Our regulations are going to building standards for formal 45-day review shortly, actually. They're due by the end of this month. And there will be an opportunity for all of you to comment on the proposed regulations in this regulatory package. We do address different levels of charging with different ports, and so it's very important to understand that concept. However, Marjorie is correct in the fact that until these regulations are approved and effective, which won't be until July 1st, 2021, if approved, the regulations that are in the building code do stand as regulations, and they're applied by the local jurisdiction as written in the code. For those of you who are designers, for those local jurisdictions who are installing these facilities, in your areas of which you are the owner as well, the city being the owner for public charging, understand just the basic requirements of access, which means equal service. And I allow that to you as guidance because for those charging manufacturers, you wouldn't want to put your own owners in jeopardy. And for those who are providing charging on behalf of the city as owners, you need to always understand the basic access of the ADA. So always ask yourself a question: am I providing access to it from an individual who's disabled in the design beyond the regulations? Just to let you know, we're doing improvements to the regulations because our regulations were started 5 years ago. Our process to develop regulations takes about 2 years before they can even get into the code book. And the jurisdictional agencies will only interpret what's in the code book. But just understand the overarching requirement of the ADA as the nature evolves, and ask yourself the question, is access being provided equally? In other words, if you have a level 3 charger, is access being provided to it? If you have a power. Just look at it from that lens until our regulations are adopted and can be addressed.
Right. Thank you, Ida.